All right, so our topic today is database deployment methods demystified. So, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Deborah Melkin. I've been working as a database professional for over 20 years. I mainly work with SQL Server, but I've worked with a little bit with some of the other database platforms. I mainly work on transactional systems or day-to-day systems, but I've done a little bit with marts and warehouses, just enough so I could do some damage. Um, I'm a board member of the New England SQL Server User Group. It is the local user group for the greater Boston area, which is where I am. Last year, I was named one of the Redgate 100, so I was very honored by that. And one of the ones I'm most honored at is I'm a Microsoft MVP for the data platform, which to me means I love having talks and sharing this information and thinking about databases with all of you and getting to share and have this exchange of ideas. So I'm very honored by that one, and I'm still feeling like I need to live up to it. But that's not the important stuff. This is the important stuff to know about me. I'm a longtime member of my alto section at my choir. I actually just stepped down as section leader. I try to go to bluegrass jams regularly. So I have a guitar I've been learning as part of that, and a mandolin I've been neglecting. I love musical theater, so happy to have conversations about that anytime. And when I'm not doing any of that, my husband, some of you may know him because he's involved in the community, Andy Yoon. He and I like to do geeky things with our dog, like pose him in front of computers, like he knows what he's doing. But this is probably not why you tuned in. You probably tuned in to hear talk about database deployments. And the reason why I wanted to have this conversation is because this is real to me. It's really kind of one of those fundamental things. We talk about DevOps, we talk about how everything implements, but I feel like sometimes understanding and or even appreciating the process, we don't take the time to acknowledge that and think about it from that perspective. Because again, we have our databases, we have changes, magic happens, and those changes magically appear in the database. And it's not magic that happens. There's a lot of work that goes into it. And the way that we do it, it's pretty inclusive of or encompassing everything that we do in a sense when we work with databases. We hear DevOps a lot, and DevOps is really about kind of the entire process, or that's what it was intended to be. I was asked about recently what DevOps meant to me, and I was thinking deployments, right? Because it's again, so that deployment process, the whole process is. Because the thing is, we all have code to deploy. We have changes to the database that need to be made, and we need to get them out. And the way we do this is our everyday workflow. And this is why I kind of love the idea of having this conversation is really thinking about how these deployment methods and how we choose to deploy our databases affect what we do on a day-to-day level, and we don't even think about what those mean. Um, there's a phrase out there, data ops, so it's not DevOps, it's data ops. Um, I'm not sure if how much I hold stock into all of this sort of thing, but because to me, in the end, it comes down to this. It doesn't matter whether you're agile or whether you're waterfall or waterfall pretending to be agile or agile pretending to be waterfall. If you have database changes, you need to be able to deploy them. And there are a couple different ways. And it's funny because you get used to one way and you don't understand the other way that you can do this or think about what it works or how it could work or what you're trying to solve for because in the end that's what we're trying to do. How do we get these changes out the door? And I never wanted to put this session as a DevOps session because for me it's beyond that or it's not just DevOps. It's really thinking about the methodology and the work that we do. So I just kind of wanted to level set in what this is because the other thing for me is this is stuff that we've had conversation with in my company and you have people who are very much we do things this way or you do things this way. And for me, I wanted to understand them and have an appreciation for what they did, how they work and go from there. So a lot of what we're going through, you may say, Deborah, I already do this. I already know this. But for me, I'm trying to learn some of this stuff, and I've been working with this stuff for a while, but there's always something new to learn. And if nothing else, I hope you walk away with a little bit of appreciation for what we deal with as part of the process. So I wanted to start with a couple related terms and things we need to think about. And I'm not going to focus so much on these later, but I think these are a lot of the driving factors of when we think about how we work with databases and how we deploy our changes, it kind of comes into kind of the intellectual or the high level overview of what we're trying to do or the guiding principles to thinking of these things. So the first one is the idea of a source of truth. So what I'm defining source of truth as is an artifact used to determine what the database should contain, depending on the version or features that have been released. So at some point, we need to say, this is what my database is. This is what it should look like. And we need a way to say what that is. We also thing with the source of truth is you could have multiple source of truth. Why? You could have multiple versions of your database. This was October release. This was version 17.5.2. And each of those has a source of truth. They're not the same source of truth because they're not necessarily the same version of the database or database schema, I should say, but they are the source of truth for what that version is. And we need a way to do it. I would argue against having your source of truth be an actual database. Why? Because we make changes to a database. It's not necessarily a reliable source of truth because of that. And you can have the best practices in place to make sure that nothing gets past your policy of getting changes in that database. But let's face it, there's always a way around it. Like that mission critical performance problem that's solved by adding an index. That index, you got to put it out in production before you can put it through your development process. I mean, hopefully in the end, it's the right index. But because of how it gets added to the database, it gets added to production first because the client can't work. Um, we've now taken that database and our source of truth is no longer accurate because we're making changes. That's why I don't like a database itself to be a source of truth. Um, Something for me, good source of truth is something you can check into source control, where you can label it or you can branch it and you can almost create an immutable version of it. There may still be mistakes with it, but you have that starting point that you can trust as to what it is. So a source of truth is really important, and being able to maintain that, I think, is a really important part of when we talk about deployments and being able to have that. This next one, database as code. This one was a really harder one to grab and conceptualize and make sure we have a good understanding of. So this is the idea that database development should follow the same guidelines as the general software development lifecycle or SDLC principles. And if we think about the way that software architecture has gone over the years, database architecture has been asked to follow along. When we think about database as code, we think about, yes, we need to add things to source control. We still have trouble with that. We need to think about things like how do we add those changes to our pipelines for CI/CD? How do we integrate making our software changes with our database changes? Um, it's funny because I often feel like database as code, but we don't treat database as our software code as a kind of dichotomy. But the fact that we're still asked to have database as code, like platform as code, as infrastructure as code, database as code is one of those things as database developers we need to think about. Um, One thing I should put a caveat is you can definitely tell where I've been working over the years. I've always worked with software developers. Every company I've worked at as a database professional has been a software company, and I've always been on the development side working with the engineers as we create our applications and have to bring those out. So a lot of what we're following here, it comes from my experience or the way that I think about it from that. And it's definitely a different approach. So hopefully that'll come through as we're talking about this. And so you kind of see what I mean. Um, but again, this database as code is really fundamental to what we're trying to do here. And also making sure that we can make our changes and treat it the same way that we do, pretty much any other piece of our software development applications. So requirements. Because yes, I think releases need to have requirements. So what do I mean by requirements? What would be requirements with deployments? One, I want to be able to create a brand new database or upgrade an existing one. Does it have to be the same batch of code? Not necessarily, but I need to be able to create a new database or upgrade an existing one. That newly created database and that upgraded existing database must have the same schema by the time we're done. So, however we do it, I need those two things to be the same. Now, obviously, there's this little caveat here because if you have an existing database and you've upgraded it over time, you're going to start having deprecated objects. That table you no longer need, the store procedure that's been replaced by something else, code that's been changed, refactored, all sorts of now junk that's been collected over the years. We know that it's going to happen. I don't want to call it schema drift because it's artifacts of previous versions of the database, but it is something that you want to have a strategy for deprecating. Because again, if you refactor, 20 tables because you needed to completely redesign it, upgrade it, fix all the problems with the old data, you're still going to have a lot of data that's just kind of sitting there taking space that's never going to be used. So you do want to have a strategy for handling some of that longer term. But it's acknowledging that that you may find that in an upgraded database. My last requirement is deployments have to be rerunnable. Think about you've got a script, you hit execute, great, you accidentally hit execute again and you didn't mean to. You want to make sure you don't do any damage when that script runs again. And so essentially same thing with a deployment. If I do a deployment to a database that's already been upgraded, I don't want to necessarily have things upgraded again. I don't want to have something run that shouldn't run that maybe, essentially I want to make sure my data integrity is intact by the end. I don't want to damage the database if I accidentally run something again. Or it shouldn't matter how many times I run it. I can guarantee that my database is in a good state no matter what at the end of the deployment. So these are my personal requirements. So a lot of the demos that I'm going to show you are trying to stick to these principles. Your requirements may be different. Some of these, I hope they're the same. We never want a deployment to do harm to our database. So we want to deal with what happens if someone accidentally deploys something that they shouldn't have or when they shouldn't have. But again, it's making sure that we know what those requirements are. There may be extra caveats that you have or extra requirements that you want to add upon that. And that's going to be business decisions. And you're going to want to work with uh, your release team or your DevOps team, whatever you want to call them, or whatever the titles are, and making sure you know what those are so you can meet each of those. Because that's also going to figure into your deployment methods, how you set those up, and what sort of things that you need to return or be able to provide to people as a result. So, with that, when we talk about databases, they're kind of essentially two forms of deployments. You're going to either have a migration based deployment or a state based deployment. And most things figure into that. Um, and in some ways, this is going to be the easiest thing I'm going to cover, the least complicated thing, because in some ways, this is kind of the simplest thing. And in a sense, the basic thing to understand. There are lots of caveats as we look at certain details and implementations later, but it's a pretty straightforward two options for deploying our scripts. So let's take a look at these. Starting off with a migration-based deployment. It's pretty simple, and I feel it's pretty straightforward. I'm defining it as a series of scripts executed to deploy database changes. And it's just that. So we have our source database to the left and our target to the right. And for those of you who know, I don't know if this made it over outside the US, but these somehow look like Lucky Charms cereal marshmallows. I don't know how that happened, but we're just going to go with it for an example here. So when we talk about a migration script, what we want in the end is my target to look like my source. So my migration scripts, I'm going to say what these scripts look like. I'm going to add one blue star, I'm going to add one pink heart, and I'm going to add one green moon. And when my scripts say these are what we're doing, in the end, my target will look like my source. Sounds simple enough. But what if we have this as our second target? Well, what I described originally isn't going to work. So I need to understand that my target and my target two may look different. Or I need to understand that. So I may change how I write my scripts. So instead of saying one blue star, make sure there are four blue stars. Instead of one pink heart, make sure there are three pink hearts at the end, or make sure there's one green moon. So now I can change my migration scripts to handle things that I may encounter in my databases depending on how I write my scripts. But there's a caveat here. And this is when we start dealing with the ideas of schema drift, when things kind of shift off of what I expect. Because now we have this lightning bolt. I don't know where this lightning bolt came from. Or do I? But that's a question I have to know. This also um, means that you need to understand your database if you're doing migration scripts. You need to know what's expected. This is why that source of truth is important. Because then when you run across something that's not there, one, do you know that you need to look for it? Maybe this lightning bolt was a deprecated table. Maybe it's okay to leave it there. Maybe you did customization for a client, and so this was that customization. Maybe you don't want anything in this database other than what you've defined. So what do you need to add something that looks for objects that don't exist? And if so, what are you doing with those? So as part of a migration script, everything that you do, you are the person defining what it is. And you need to define how you handle it for everything. And it's very individual. So you really have to know and understand what you're doing to make sure you get those migration scripts properly done. So there are a couple tools that are commonly used. This is not a comprehensive list of tools. I want to be honest with that and I want to be forthright. These are just a couple that I'm aware of or that I've used. There's definitely more that are out there if you look for them. A couple of the third-party ones that I know are Liquibase and Flyway. Both of these work very similarly, where they have tables inside your database. And what they do is they look at the scripts, your migration scripts, and they say, okay, I run this, I run this, I run this, if it has not been run. If it has been run, both of them have checksums to say, hey, have I run this script before? If the checksums match, say, nope, I don't need to run it. If the checksums are different, then they have different ways that you can set them up to say, oh no, this is a problem, stop deployment. Or they can say, yeah, I know this one's changed, but you said I can run it if there's a change, so I'm going to go ahead and run it. So you do need to be careful of making sure that when you have those changes, it's still running that correct version of the script. So you have the most recent one there. But again, those are caveats, and there's a lot of flexibility in how you can set those up and how you can program those and make those work for your deployment. So that way, everything is out the door properly. You can also do these as homegrown tools, PowerShell and DBA tools. Hey, go run all my scripts in this folder. You can use SQL command to do the same thing. Here are my scripts, go run them. And you can sit there and you can configure it. You can do lots of different things lots of different ways that you have these. I've had companies where I worked at the installer. It was a proj file, which is XML. And so the installer would read the proj file, and then I think it ran SQL command or something like that against all the different scripts. But again, we had the XML file that dictated the order that everything got ran in. So it worked that way. So it's a very flexible way of doing this because again, you get to say how everything is done and you get to design it and it's your scripts. So there's a lot of flexibility in that what you can do and lots of different ways you can do this. Any questions yet? This is still pretty straightforward. All right. And if you have questions, again, please add them to the chat and I will get to them when I can. So the next one we want to talk about is state-based deployment. So what is state-based? So it's a comparison between your target database and your source that determines what the difference are. It creates the SQL needed for the updates and then executes those changes. This is where you start hearing the term DACPAC and backpack, or mostly probably DACPAC, because that's how those work. It is that state-based deployment. So using our example here, our same source and target databases, for a state-based migration, it's pretty simple. It runs a compare against the source and target, figures out the changes, and then applies them. And that's it. So you don't have any, well, you can have some say in how this works or how it does changes, but essentially something else is determining what needs to happen and will make the changes for you. Now for our target 2, it works the exact same way. It runs the compare against the source and target, and it applies the changes. Now we still have the question about what that lightning bolt is. Is it a deprecated object? Is it schema drift? Is it what is it and what were you supposed to do? Again, you can configure these tools to say, hey, here's what I want to happen whenever I run across objects that are not in my source. So it's a very, again, it's a simple thing, but something else is creating that compare. But it also means that these two things are not the same. The same script is not necessarily applied to both our target and target 2. It's doing whatever it's needed based on what's in the target in order to determine what the changes are. So a couple third-party tools. A lot of these kind of use the same basic things underneath. I'm calling it a third-party tool when I mentioned SQL Package EXE or SQL Server Data Tools, which is what's in Visual Studio. But Data Tools underneath the cover actually uses SQL Package. So that's what you'll find for creating your DAC packs or data application tier packages. Um, Redcape SQL change automation is considered does kind of state-based. Any tool that you have, third-party tool that does the data compare or the database compares and it says here's your change script, that change script is your state-based migration because again, you have your source, you have your target, here's what the difference are, and here's the script that'll apply those changes. You can use homegrown tools, DBA tools. It's got tools for using DAC packs, the published DBA DAC packs. I actually worked at a company once where one of the teams created an internal comparison tool because essentially what are you doing with the compare? You need what your metadata is. This is what it's supposed to look like compared to the database's metadata. And then you can figure out how to write those changes and make sure everything's applied over. So they did this, oh, it was so long ago that I don't remember when DAC packs were introduced, but I'm wondering if it was predated that too or if there was also I think it was always SQL Server. But again, you could technically create your homegrown version of this if you wanted to. Um, I would just use DAC packs and kind of work with that structure personally, but it's kind of up to you. Um, so any questions about that so far? All right. So I thought I'd take it kind of deviate here. Normally, I like doing pros and cons, and normally I wait till after demos, but I kind of wanted to get through these now just because there's always so much to show and always so many details to work through. I think it may be easier if we actually talk about what the pros and cons are before we look at what they are and see how things work. So my coworkers will tell you that I am team migration. I like migrations. I'm very controlling over my scripts, and I like things run a certain way because I know my databases and they acknowledge this. I know my databases. I know what things should look like at the end. I'm very good at trying to test things because the other thing is this is what I am used to using. Um, the cool thing that I like about database migration scripts is you get to determine everything. You know your folder structure, you know your naming convention, you know the order of scripts to be executed, and you get to choose the tool used for deployment. Like there's a lot of choice with this. And if you're someone like me and you are that particular with things, this is awesome. So I'm a huge fan of that because I like the control and I know how things need to work. Um, and there's a lot of flexibility with this too. Again, think about how you can, if you're using PowerShell, y'all know how powerful that is as a tool. Being able to kind of loop through things. I need this to go first, or how you can set everything up. It's a lot of flexibility to that. This is probably for me the most important one. I know that the code that I've checked in is the code is going to be run. And I've already tested it because I wrote that script and I've probably executed like 10 times before I check it in. So I know it's going to work. Um, so I can trust it. Again, it's great for someone like me who does have problems with control issues. I admit it, and I'm on tape being recorded saying I have issues with that. But it's one of the things that I really like about migration scripts is I know that things are going to work. I can get things to set up and work in the way that they need to so I can get the highest success rate and it's repeatable and I know it's going to work. So, pros of state based. So, this is the one that I've learned about recently. And part of what's driven me to do this session is I realize I don't understand a lot of this stuff. And I want to, and I didn't like it because of what I could get out of migration. But as I've worked more and got an understanding of way some of these things work, especially as I'm working with things like database projects, I've gained a lot of appreciation for this. There is a lot of configuration available. You can sit there and say, hey, if something doesn't exist, add it. Or if it does exist because it's schema drift or certain things, leave it. Or no, go ahead and drop it. I need this to look exactly this way. And there are ways that you can build in changes for some of the things that it can't handle properly. So there's configurations. It can automatically identify those schema drifts. And that's a big thing to a lot of people. They don't like schema drifts. They like, ooh, that's bad. Um, we need to eliminate it. And this will take care of that for you. It's automatically designed for new installs and upgrades. If there are no objects there, it's automatically going to create everything. If it's upgraded, it's automatically going to figure out what the changes are for you. If you do a migration phase, you have to figure out, do I want the same set of scripts for installs and upgrades? Do I want them separated? Do I want something in the middle? How do I handle all of those things? So those are choices you have to make with a migration that you don't have to worry about here. It's going to take care of it for you. Database projects have a couple cool things with it. One of it, the structure for storing your code is kind of built in. It gives you options when you create a brand new database project. How do I want to store things? Again, migration, you got to figure that out. Here, there are a couple options for you already. This is a cool one that I'm appreciating more and more these days, and it's object validation. So when we think about databases code, database projects are really kind of encompassing that. So you have a way to build, but part of that build is object validation. Is everything aligned? Do you have? Does this object exist? Does the object exist the way that you think it does? It'll figure out if there are bugs in your. Well, this one doesn't figure out if there's bugs, but it makes sure that you have everything that is correct. Or is there a problem with your code or something? Some of the basic issues with that. That object validation is a really nice thing that's automatically there, and understanding that it's there and how you can use it to really kind of help protect your code before it goes out. um, I think it's a nice thing, and I'm starting to think about ways that you can use it a little bit more. And it's a very nice feature, and I think it's underrated, and we don't think about promoting what this means for our database codes. One of those things with object validation is that concept of cross database dependencies, and thinking about when you have that as interoperability and those relationships, this can kind of help you with that, especially if you've got one database, there's another team which has another database. If they change something and that object's no longer there, when you do your build, it'll say, oh, this thing is a problem. So those are really nice dependencies and nice checks to take advantage of. As with everything, you've got cons with migrations deployments. Um, you determine everything: folder structure, naming convention, execution order scripts, tools used for deployment. Uh, this is the first thing that I had as one of the pros for migrations, right? Because you get to determine everything, but you get to determine everything. That's a lot of work to do and a lot of things to figure out. And if you're setting this up for a first time, it's going to get kind of complicated. When you've worked with it for a while, you kind of learn those pros and cons, thinking order of scripts. Well, I've got tables, I have foreign keys, so I need to make sure those tables get added beforehand. I've played with it long enough to say, well, if I have my foreign keys as separate in a separate folder structure from my tables, I can go run my tables in whatever order. Then I can run my foreign keys in whatever order, and I don't care because I know all my tables are there. But you also figure out like basic things in terms of like which object order works well, like tables, foreign keys, maybe functions, views, store procedures. You start figuring out what the best order of those things are if you work with it long enough. But if you're new for it, having to go through all of these steps and figure out what's going to work best, it's hard. It's complicated, and you're going to have a lot of trial and error to figure those things out. Even naming conventions, it seems simple, but it's tough. Trust me. Schema drifts have to be handled manually. If you don't know schemas drifted, if you don't know to look for a schema drift, you're going to miss those. And you have to figure out if you're okay with that. If you're not okay with that, how are you going to handle it? How do you figure out, well, this is what I'm supposed to be here. How do I know if it's not supposed to be here? So that can be a problem. Again, you need to determine how to handle new installs versus upgrades. I've worked in places where we had one set of scripts for installs and one set of scripts for upgrades. Um, Same place, another project, everything was the same for installs and upgrades. And if we had to do certain things separately, because let's say we refactored a whole set of tables, I had a whole bunch of scripts to handle just those along the way. And then I had to write for things like my tool only had, it was a .NET connection, so I only had 30 seconds to get things done. So, you start figuring out what some of those implications on how you wrote the scripts and how you did the migration process and how you set everything up. So it can get really tricky once you get to some of those levels. Um, you're going to have those with any sort of migration or any sort of deployment, really. But again, you've got to handle new installs versus upgrades, same scripts, separate scripts, hybrid. How do you manage that? Depending on what your tools are, that's also going to tell you what sort of options you have. All right, cons of state-based deployments. Can't handle all situations. This is kind of an important one because there are things where, let's say um, you have data loss. There are certain times where it will generate script and say, I'm getting rid of this column. You're going to have data loss, so I can't do this. So you have to go and figure things out. If you take an existing store procedure, move it to a new schema, it doesn't know that you moved it from a different schema. Or it may not know that you want to keep the object ID the same and just shift things over. So it's not going to handle that for you because it doesn't know. It just says, this is what I started. This is where I'm going. What do I have to do to make the change? So you have to be able to be prepared to say, in certain situations, I want you to handle it this way. A lot of them, so essentially, migration scripts are still required. So depending on what you're doing, certain things are only going to be for schema. Well, what if you have default data that needs to go out there? What if your deployment changes to fix data and move things around because of new schema or fix bugs and so on and so forth? So state migration scripts, in some ways, state-based is almost a hybrid in itself because you may have to create migration scripts along the way. So it's one of those things that you have to really think about as you're doing this. It can take longer when you have a large number of objects and dependencies. So if you have a very complex database, state-based can't always handle all of the things that you need to do. And you need to think about the time that you have. How long is it going to take? And you're going to want to test it. Um, is it a certain point where it tips over and it's not doesn't work as well? You got to think about that and just understanding that if it takes longer, you need to be prepared for that and build that into your deployment process. Script changes can differ from one target database to another target database. So again, from my example, you saw I had two different targets. The changes needed were different. You don't know what those changes are until you run the deployment. Um, some people see this as a bad thing. Some people see it as a good thing because, again, it doesn't matter where it started. You know it's going to be the same at the end. Some people are like, I need to know what's going to run. Um, and what do you mean it's not going to be the same compared to from database to database? Uh, that scares some people. What does that mean for your schema drift out there? Um, it's a is it a good thing that it's essentially eliminating it? What does that mean? Or it works for one place, but you need the different migration script for when it runs in this place. It could get really complicated depending on what your target sources look like and figuring out how those things work. If you're working with a database project, you start having restrictions how the code can be written. If it's going to be included as part of the build, you can only do create statements. You can't say create or alter. So it's no create or alter store procedure, it's just create store procedure. Why? Because the comparison is going to figure out whether you're creating it or whether you're altering it. So because of that, the same script that you're going to check in for your database project and make sure your build works isn't quite the same script that you just checked in. I mean, it's based off of it because of the way it pulls everything together, but as I work on a script, my create or alter, I have to change it, and that's not what I'm running when I'm testing or developing. It should end up being the same, and you should test for that. But for me, it's like I like knowing that my script that I just wrote, just checked in, is the one that's being run. So, but the fact that how you write the code differs, that's one thing to kind of keep into mind. So at this point, I'm going to check to see if there are any questions and take a little bit of tea. All right, I don't see any questions. So let me kind of jump in and show you what I'm talking about for examples. Um, so I'm going to start here, over here. So I'm going to start with migration scripts. Right now I am using, I created a polyglot, a .NET Interact, formerly known as .NET Interactive Notebook to handle this because I'm going to go back and forth between PowerShell and querying my database, and I thought I'd be clever and show both of these things at once. So one thing that I did is let me show you my structure for my database project. Uh, Hopefully you can see this. I don't know if I can, uh, it just, sorry, I wanted to be over here. So this is my folder structure. I have schema, store procedure, tables, and then I have a PowerShell script here. And so let's take a look at my PowerShell script. And in some ways, it's a very simple PowerShell script, and at some point, maybe I'll get fancy with it. But again, this is one of those things that I decided how I was going to do a migration script and show it to you all. So also another note for how what I've set up for my database is I took a database, empty database. I created a store procedure that would dynamically create a number of tables and store procedures that would select from those tables. Just randomly give it a number. So I think I created like 500 tables and 500 store procedures to select everything from those tables. So my store procedure, my script here, I've set my location, I have my instance, and I can make those parameters later on. I have a couple things that I want to do first. I like having an audit log. It saved me so many times this year to have an audit log because if you're running a long process, you want to see where things are. Also, for me, having that audit log, I can say, "Hey, look, see it ran," and we can see what the results are. This is just a very simple thing, but because I need this first, I'm going to create this on a brand new database, but I'm also going to say that this same script and my same, this same PowerShell script and my scripts that are checked in, they should be able to run whether it's an install or an upgrade. So everything is the same. Again, I talked about my requirements for this. Everything will be the same. But again, I need to make sure for a brand new database, my log table is created first because everything I'm going to do, I want to log in that table in my database. So that's the first thing. So I can specify here, go run my schema, my deploy schema, and my deploy log. So that way I can make sure my schema exists and my table exists, and then I can run. Then I'm going to determine my location, and then I'm going to add all my schemas. I'm going to add my tables, my foreign keys, my functions, my views, my stored procs, and then my data. Um, so you can kind of see that I've been playing with this a bit to figure out what order I like things run in. But this is also set, so if I need to put something in a different order, I can do that too. It's a pretty, it's not the best PowerShell, and I'm sure those of you who know PowerShell like Deborah, you could write this a little better. One day I'll update it, but for now, this kind of works for what I'm doing. The other thing that I guess I will go ahead and show you is one of my tables. These all look the same. So again, I have the if it doesn't exist, create the table. So again, I can run the script multiple times and I know it will work. And then if I go to my store procedures, again, it's, oops, let's just do a random one. My store proc similar. If it exists, if it doesn't exist, create an empty version of it, and then I can alter it, and it'll look great. And then, hey, look, I even have some security here. Uh, this was all generated from my original database because it was easier to do when you have 500 scripts. Actually, no, I think it's at 500 store procs and 500 tables. So now I can go and I can run this. So let's do, whoops, wrong. This is where I'm going. So I've already connected. I'm going to confirm that I have a brand new database. So I dropped my old one, a new one. Let me see if I can make this a little larger. If y'all can't see it, let me know. This doesn't seem to be wanting to scroll in very well right now. And then I'm going to go run my PowerShell script to run my migration script. And as it's running, you can see I like messages. I like knowing where things are when things run. So I'm going through, you can see the folder that everything's run from. I'm adding my tables, and it takes a bit because I'm adding 500 tables. Same for my store procedures. And again, 500 store procs takes a couple seconds. And then we can see it's done because that's all I have. You saw my script that I was expecting more, but because I didn't have anything, it skipped over it. And so now I can connect to my database. And we can now see that looking from sys tables, I've got a couple objects here. And then we can look at my migration log and we can say start, end. So later I could write a script, create a log, and kind of say, hey, how long did it take for everything to run? And I can see all of that. So now I want to add a data file. Well, I've got some sample data set up. I have a script in a demo files for data already created. And so essentially what I want to do is, if I look, we can see I don't have any data from my lookup table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add my data folder and then at my data file. My PowerShell script automatically says, hey, if there's data, if there's something in this folder, go run it. So I can run this. I've added that. And then I'm going to rerun my deployment script. And so while we do that, I can go and I can show you my data folder is now here. You look, it wasn't here before. It's been added. And if I look at my script, I'm creating this, creating a bunch of data. I've decided that if it doesn't exist, I want to delete. If it is there, I want to update it. And if it's missing, add it. Again, how you want to do this is up to you. You get to decide. I could have written this as a merge, but I was still feel a little weird using merge statements. But again, this is up to you and how to do it. But you get to make that determination of what it is. Maybe I want to only add stuff if it doesn't exist. If maybe a client can change it. I have to understand how this works to go from here. So if we go back, we can see my script is finished. And notice, remember, I said everything ran. And I don't have any errors here. Why? Because I wrote everything to say if it doesn't exist, add it. If it exists, go to the next. So I want that repeatability of having those same scripts run over and over. And then now I can look. And hey, look, I've got data now. So again, it's built into my process. Now, what if I want to do a schema change? So now I've got to do a couple extra things. So now I've got to add a new schema. Now I need to change my store procedure to move to the new schema. And also remember, I'm using source control. So now I've got to rename it in my source control to make sure I keep my file history, and then I can rerun it. So this is going to my demo files. I have my demo setup schema here. So if I edit this, if I look over here, whoops, bring it over. We can see I have a script here for demo setup. And then I should also have this where it alters the schema, so I can add this over in my creator alter. So I'm going to take this. I can go back to my store procedures. Should go back here, store procedures, go down here. Where did it go? Action. Why is it? My script is hiding on me, because of course it is. But I can add this here, and honestly, it's going to be picked up. Why is it going to be picked up? Because it's in the folder. It's going to exist. I can then rename this, add this, do what I need, run my script, and have that change. But the thing is, because I have it here, it's in the right folder. It's going to get picked up because it follows everything. And then because I'm saying alter schema, if it's not, if it's already DBO, then it knows it's there. And then I can have my creator alter as needed. So I've determined what that change is. I'm doing it manually because I know what I need to have done. So any questions on this so far? All right. So let's move over and look at this through our database project, kind of doing the similar thing. So let's go over here. So I'm using Visual Studio 2022, and I have a database project. And we can see right now, this looks very similar to what you saw earlier. I've got store procedures, I have tables, and it's set up to have my DBO. Now I mentioned database projects, you can have validation. So you can do that by right-clicking on references and choosing add a database reference. Because I happen to know that I have some dynamic SQL, so I can sit there and say, I want to add my master as a database reference. So I can add this in. You can do things like you can make reference other DAC packs, you can reference other database projects. You need to determine if you have cross-database dependencies, how you want that done. But I can add that in and I can have a reference to my master database, or I can another one depending on what sort of reference you need. So then I can do a build, it'll put my package together and it'll tell you if there's any errors or warnings, little things, hey, this doesn't line up, and you can go from there. And so when it's done, it will create my DAC pack in a different folder. So I'm going to go over to my database project folder. I'm going to close this to simplify things. And we see the bin directory, and that's created by Visual Studio. And when you go into bin debug, this is where you find your DAC pack. So this is your database application tier. So this just means it's your schema or anything that you need included as part of that project. Because I said I wanted to reference my master database, it also included the master DAC pack, because part of what it does when it builds and when it goes to do the compares, it does that object validation that I was talking about. Now, just for a moment, I want to show you something about a DAC pack. The DAC pack, if I made this change, all a DAC pack is, I think this is kind of cool, it's a zip file. So I can go in here and we can see that all it is a bunch of XML files. I've actually pulled out the model, and so we can look at it, because what's kind of interesting is what's here and what isn't. So if I pull this over, we can see it's an XML file. And so now we can see everything it does, and it's a little bit of the magic, what's behind the magic of what it looks at. Because now we can see the store procedure, and we can see the body script, and we can see what's here. When we get down to the bottom and we start looking things at tables, we can see like it creates the unique constraints are all different so that we don't attach those to the table. So it kind of gives you a hint of how it figures out those sort of things. The other thing I find really interesting, same thing for primary keys. Let's go to our columns. So this is for lookup table 63. And as we look at our columns, we can see information, but one thing that we don't see is the ordinal position. So depending on how you add things, check things in, or deploy things, and release things, your column order may be different depending on how it got deployed, or if you have multiple deployments or versions or different environments, and how those sort of things get changed, and how you deploy things, how you test things, how you build things. So ordinal position, again, kind of I don't know if it's necessarily as important that everything is in the same order these days in terms of a performance thing, but in terms of making sure everything matches and you don't have any sort of weird things with a compare, like, hey, I have it in this order and on this date in this database, it's in this order. That could cause issues. How do you want to handle those and certain things to think about because we don't have the ordinal. I don't see the ordinal position here. I've looked, but I haven't found it. So if it is, it's hiding somewhere. Otherwise, it's the order that it's creating it in the XML file, which I find really interesting. So I don't know what that means other than it's really fascinating to look at. The other thing that I'll point out is I don't have the copy here, but one thing I did test is your backpack, which is when you create your database application tier is what we created from our database project. What we can do is once we have something with data in it, we can go to that database and we can create what's called a backpack. So it is similar to a data application tier, but it includes your data. Let me see if quickly if I can pull that up. If I go to my object, my SQL Server Object Explorer, and you don't need a database project to create either a DAC pack or a backpack solution. So let me see if I can add this quickly. So I can show you how you can create that. So if I take this migration where I just created data, I can do, I believe it's the extract data application tier. That one's DAC pack. There is a way to create that, and for some reason, I'm not finding it quickly. Um, Publish, extract. All right, of course, I'm not finding it quickly, but you can create
I think it
uh,
is that extract, isn't it?
I thought it
Yeah,
was extract, but I'm not seeing it for
yeah.
some reason.
For
So,
the
oh, actually, here it is,
the
extract data and tables, schema and data. And then, but it's showing up here, the DAC pack. So let's see if let's test this, shall we? Because, all right, I'm having problems with this right now, but it is one of these and you can extract the data. And when you extract the data, what it will do is it'll create something similar to the data application tier. But what it also includes, it includes all your data. And what I wanted to really show you with that is this is what comes in that data in that file, which is your BCP. So you can have your data, but the one thing I will warn you about that is it's not encrypted. So if you are using a backpack with a B, be careful about where you put it, and especially if checking things in, you may not want to because, oh my gosh, that's all your data. So you want to watch security with that, especially people who shouldn't have access to it. But one of those things to think about. I'm not sure why I can't create it right now, and I apologize for that. But play around with it, see if you can get it. And like I said, you can dig into the package as a zip file, and you can find all of that fun stuff there. But getting back to what we're talking about at hand. My state database right now, as we can see, has no objects. So let me publish my solution here, my DAC pack. So I'm going to hit publish. Um, I'm going to add this as my target connection. Now, one thing to note is I said this is pretty configurable. If you hit advanced, you can see all of these different options. And by the way, if you use SQL package exe or if you use the data tools to deploy your DAC pack, you've got all of this stuff available as well. This is, like I said, this is what I'm still learning, which is why I'm fumbling a little more than I like. But it's one of those things that you can see and you can play with as you're working with this and testing these things and making sure that you're setting this up properly. Hey, you can even back up your database before deployment. That seems like a really important one that people will want. But again, you have all those different things. We talked about schema drifts. How do we handle those? What do you do with objects that exist or don't exist? Maybe you don't want things dropped. Drop constraints not in source or DML triggers. You know, we have a lot of different things there. Or you can say you can ignore things. For example, if you are putting extended properties for definitions, maybe you don't want those deployed, but you get choices. And the other thing is you get to, I'm going to take what's here by default, but the other thing is you can save this profile. So I can save this as my project published, but you can set up different publish profiles if they're going to different environments. Hey, my dev environment, I want to have this. My QA, I want this. And then you can set things up the way you need and you can test those, you can save those, and you can call those again. So taking kind of just the basic, other things to show you, you can generate the script. I don't know what it's going to do yet. I'm not going to choose this because we can see my database is empty. So I'm just going to hit publish. So first what it's doing is that's a fun bug. Um, let's try this again. See, every time I do this, this is one of those things. So let's try starting my build. And I'm just going to hit publish. There it goes. I'm just going to blame Visual Studio. So now we can see that it's creating my database script. I can see my script, so I can see exactly what was run. Um, but now it's executing, and so we can review results, but we don't need to because really what I want to do is I want to refresh. And now we can see that I'm going to have a lot of tables drop down here because it's trying to figure out all of them. So um, that's going to take a while, so let's hide this for a moment. So that's a pretty easy thing and a pretty straightforward thing. But now we're talking about adding changes. So I need to add data. So I'm going to add a new folder and I'm going to call it data. And now I'm going to add existing item. So I'm going to go to my demo files and I'm going to pick up that data file that I used before and I'm just going to add it. And so now we have it here. So one of the things that's really important to do is we can see that's the same script. Is we now talk about how the build works. Um, as we know, I've got multiple statements in here, insert updates and deletes. And as I mentioned earlier, database projects get very particular about this. So now what I need to do is I need to look at the properties for this, F4. Build action I've set to none because what happens if I set it to build? It's doing things here that, as I said in database projects, it won't let me do. And I get an error, only one statement allowed per batch. So maybe I need word go between things. So it starts getting very particular in how you write things. But the other thing is, a lot of times when you do multiple changes for data, I find that I can't get them to go here because I have multiple statements, I need multiple things done. What if I need to use a variable that goes through these multiple statements? Well, adding an operator such as go is going to create a problem. So what I want to do is I actually really want to add a script to run post deployment. So now I get to add, I'm going to add an existing item because I've already created one in my demo folder, script post deployment, and I'm going to add it. And I'm going to check the properties. I'm adding a build. And I'm saying, I think I need to say that this is a post deploy script, so it knows to run this afterwards. And if I look at this script, again, I've already created this. You can add this through your project, but you can notice something here that it uses SQL command. And you have to do that. So what it does is it takes everything and it pulls my script in here and then it will run everything. So let me see if I can do a build. And oh, I need to go this back and I need to change the property back to not include. So one thing that I do, one of the reasons I find with database projects is they are very particular. But again, some of the validation, hey, look, this is here, this isn't here. And of course, it's not liking something. Git repo. DB. And the other thing is if you always problems, the build is also this is actually a script that you can look at. So I'm trying to see if I can edit this directly because I think it's got a. See, this is why some of the times I'm not a big fan of database projects because I have to deal with this. Um, Unfortunately, let's go here, database project in here. So the proj file is something that's editable. So clearly it has something that's wrong in it. But again, the proj file is really just an XML file. There's a lot of behind the scene things you can do with this. So find DBO, DBO. You can find fixes. And every time I've been doing this demo lately, it's been creating a problem when I do this. So I'm not sure why I have so much problems with this. Again, this is why I feel like I'm team migration script because I never have this much problem before. Let's see if I can do if that fixed it. Reload. And if not, we'll keep moving for time's sake. But again, because I think we are almost at time. But you can kind of see that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get deployment scripts working. Again, every time I've been doing this, my database project has some flaws in it, and I've got to fix that. So my apologies for that. But hopefully this gives you kind of an idea of when we talk about what we're doing from a day-to-day minute. Um, this is how we work from a day-to-day thing. There's a great comment. Post-deploy is temperamental, and you need to make it a CMD script, which is the problem. Oh, that's the problem. Oh, I know where it is. That's the problem is in the CMD script. So I have a bug in my demo script. My apologies. It doesn't like it. I know where the problem is. It's this. I put the file
Right.
in the wrong directory.
But specifically, if you look, so this is, see that in the icon bar, there's a, oh, I've maybe fixed it.
Yeah, it's not letting me. The problem was I had an
All
extra
right.
DBO in my script. So, but y'all can see kind of how we troubleshoot it in day-to-day projects. So I'm still find myself very clumsy with database projects. So as we're finishing up, and you can see me fumbling with this, this gets into a lot of the different considerations of how we're working. Source control, we kind of see folder structure, naming conventions, um, database instances and environments. We need to think about how we're deploying to those different things, including security roles, release processes, how we were doing these installers, chain of command. Most importantly, who's responsible for the process so you can work with them getting things corrected. Your deployment window, your data changes, cross database dependencies, installs versus upgrades, testing. I mean, clearly I'm having a problem with the testing thing, um, customization, schema drifts, error handling, um, and how you do that. So I always find there are more questions than answers, but understanding that you're getting a database project to work versus getting a migration script to work, that part's the easy part. you know that setting up the strategy is hard because of all of these little things. How do you add it? When do you add it? Just getting the day-to-day basics. um, it's harder than it looks, but it's all the details, and it's all the small details with it too. So my apologies for running over, but I do have a bunch of resources on various things. Hopefully you have better luck. I have a bunch of general blog posts that people have about it over the years, and some of the different things you can do with database projects. Eitan Blumen has about how you can version your database projects better, so you can see which version was deployed. So there's a lot of different things about deploying those, so it's definitely worthwhile. If you have any questions, please let me know. And we have the session feedback form in the chat. Again, my apologies for going over, but I want feedback. I'm always working on improving this, trying to figure out a better way to show these things and demonstrate these things. And hopefully you have a little bit more of an appreciation of how to think about these little things and the way they work on in your day-to-day operations, and how you do your day-to-day job as we're trying to figure out how to get things out the door.